This Sunday on Closeup, we ask the question, who has the right to vote here in New Hampshire? We'll have a hard look at the domicile statute. Is it strong enough? And if not, is it being taken advantage of here in the Granite State? Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Josh McKelvin. Later in the program, we're also going to hear from Litchfield's George Lynn. Ask the question, who... This Sunday on Closeup, we ask the question, who has the right to vote here in New Hampshire? We'll have a hard look at the domicile statute. Is it strong enough? And if not, is it being taken advantage of here in the Granite State? Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Josh McKelvin. Later in the program, we're also going to hear from Litchfield's George Lambert about his potential run for governor. But first, voter eligibility. In case you missed it, the issue was in the news a bit last week, specifically on those who claim domicile in New Hampshire for the purpose of voting. Here's a look at how the law reads right now. An inhabitant's domicile for voting purposes is that one place where a person, more than any other place, has established a physical presence and manifests an intent to maintain a single continuous presence for domestic, social, and civil purposes relevant to participating in democratic self-government. Now, if that doesn't light your fire, nothing's going to. Joining me this morning, a pair of attorneys with experience in election laws. We have Martin Honigberg and Gordon McDonald, who may have differing views on the spirit of this law. Joining them with their own perspectives is Zandra Rice-Hawkins from Granite State Progress and Grant Bossy, the senior fellow from the Josiah Bartlett Center and New Hampshire Watchdog. Thanks for you all being here. First of all, let's start there. And obviously, we know about the controversy now surrounding by the domicile statute. Start with you, Martin. Is there a problem with this law, or isn't there?
There's no problem with the current law. It's been the law here with very similar laws in place virtually everywhere else for a long, long time. The concept of domicile goes back centuries, and common law definitions read a lot like our statutory definition. What's interesting about ours is at the end, the individual participation in government is really an interesting twist on our statute, and really, I think, covers exactly the kinds of people we're talking about here, who come to the state to participate in our political process, live here full-time, maintain their social ties here, and participate in our civil process. It's exactly what the framers intended with constitutional rights to vote. It's exactly what the common law domicile would contemplate, and it's perfectly consistent with the way our law has been for many, many years.
It's interesting you use the word intended, because I imagine that, Gordon, you see that there's an issue with this law. It's a slight disagreement with what Martin had to say.
First, let's just acknowledge the obvious, that everyone who has a right to vote should be voting. And the converse of that are that people who shouldn't be voting shouldn't be voting. And the principle there is it just undermines the integrity of the process. And for those who legitimately cast a vote, it dilutes their vote. In this case, you have the application of this law against some really interesting facts, where you have people here for 3 or 4 months for a very limited purpose to work on campaigns, and they go back to where they came from. And that is not consistent with the legislature's intent in defining domicile. Domicile means you have to have a sustained physical presence here and a meaningful commitment to our community. And it's simply impossible to do that on the basis of 3 or 4 months sleeping on someone's couch and working on a campaign.
And that, I imagine, Martin, is going to be an argument we hear a lot. The intention to maintain a continuous presence in New Hampshire. Campaign worker comes up, never lived in New Hampshire before, spends a few weeks, leaves after Election Day. Do they really have intent? Is that the spirit of the law?
It's up to the individual. Most of us have as our first domicile with our parents, and we have that domicile until we establish a new one. In order to establish a new domicile, we need to have two things. We need to have presence and an intention to remain. It doesn't say how long that intention to remain has to be. Historically, prior to 1972, many states required people to live for a year in a place before they could register to vote. But the Supreme Court said that violated all of our constitutional right to travel. And so all of those laws were struck. Many of them were replaced with requirements that registration be done 30 days in advance of the election. We instead go with same-day registration. So all of that plays into the same discussions, but ultimately someone who comes here and intends to declare this place as his or her domicile has every right to vote here.
Just on that, Marty raises a couple of important points. There was a Supreme Court case that says you can't have a time limitation, but in that Supreme Court case, both the U.S. and New Hampshire Supreme Court recognized that the state has a compelling interest in ensuring the integrity of the ballot box, in preventing voter fraud, in ensuring that the electorate is knowledgeable about local issues. Now, let's take the two tests there are. One, presence. Did these people show up with flip-flops and a couple of backpacks, or did they move everything up with a U-Haul? I don't know. We'll have to see. And then on intent to remain, if you show up here in July, you've got 60 days to register to your car, to change your driver's license. That would signal an intent that you're going to make this your home. Did they do that or didn't they? I think the integrity, getting back to the integrity of the process, those are important questions that we need to get answers to.
All right, let's bring in Xander and Grant here. Obviously, this was an issue that quickly became political last week, and no big surprise there. But let's, again, keep our eye on the law itself and kind of get the layman's view. We heard some legal analysis. Xander, we'll start with you. The way that it's written, again, going back to the word intent, do you think this law is fine as is, or do you think it should at the very least be looked at again, given the controversy surrounding it now?
I think the controversy is purely political attacks manufactured by the New Hampshire GOP and their supporters. If you look at the cases or the examples that they're trying to point to, they only point to examples on the Democratic side. There's plenty of examples from Republican campaign staffers who did the exact same thing, but we're not hearing Jennifer Horn, the New Hampshire GOP chair, call for any kind of investigation into those. So I think if you look at really what the intent of those bringing this issue up, it's not to look at the law, it's not to see if this is working for our state. It's a political attack at the end of the day, and that's all it is. The law is sufficient, the law is accurate, and the law says what is the truth for a lot of young adults these days. And I say young adults because largely campaign staffers are young adults, although we know we have non-traditional campaign staffers as well. But they don't know where they're going to be living 5 years from now. I came to this state with a backpack. And I lived here and I moved here. I met my husband. I've now been here for quite a while. But that's the experience of a young adult these days. You've left your parents' home. You've left college. You can't really vote.
Did you come here to work on a campaign?
I did. Yeah, I did. And you don't know what life's going to bring. If you would have asked me when I moved to the state if I planned to be here 10 years later, I had absolutely no idea. Instead, I found myself, a few months later, professing my love to the man who I'll celebrate my 6th wedding anniversary with this summer.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I mean, life takes you in different places, and we shouldn't tell a young adult who's trying to get involved in their community that they're somehow breaking the law or skirting the law, because they're invested in this community, they're working on a campaign, they're doing the exact same thing this law says, which is being involved in their local community, getting involved in the local democratic process. These young campaign staffers probably know more people, have been to more events than most of us do in our everyday life here.
All right, Grant, we'll start with the accusation that Republicans are being hypocrites here when it comes to this issue, because it happens on both sides.
Well, fine. If Republicans are parachuting people in for the end stages of a campaign and then they're leaving on Thursday or Friday after the election, prosecute them too. Nobody is talking about people who move to New Hampshire to work on a campaign and end up staying here. Colin Van Osten moved to New Hampshire to work on, I think, one of Governor Shaheen's campaigns. Ended up getting a job with the governor, stayed here. He's now an executive counselor. That's how it's supposed to work. People who move here get a lease, buy furniture, register their cars, get their driver's licenses, and work on a campaign for a year or more. Nobody's questioning that they have a right to vote in New Hampshire. But if you're coming up because Obama for America or another national organization deployed you to New Hampshire, and you're not renting an apartment, you're not changing your car registration, you're not getting a New Hampshire driver's license, you literally have no legal ties to the state of New Hampshire, you should vote where you come from. And if you want the rights of a New Hampshire voter, you should accept the responsibilities of being a New Hampshire citizen.
I do want to bring up the one example that we pointed to last week, and that is the niece of Vice President Joe Biden. She was up here for a few weeks. And if we could bring the picture of the law back up again real quick with the graphic, specifically the part where we're talking about manifest the intent to stay. She was here for a few weeks. I mean, legal analysis, Martin. She was here. She'd never put her name on a lease. I don't think anybody believes that she had any real intention to stay here after the election. Does she qualify to vote, which she did here in New Hampshire? Does she qualify to vote under this law, do you believe?
And I would just interject for one moment. My understanding is she was here, she lived here for months, not weeks.
She was back and forth. All right, be that as it may, I don't think that anybody is going to sell themselves on the idea that she meant to stay here after the election. So whether she was here for a few weeks or a few months, your analysis.
I don't know what her intention was, and unless we talked to her and got inside her head,
which we've tried to do,
can't do, which is something we can't get inside someone's head and understand what their intention is. But when you talk about the requirements, the types of requirements that Grant talked about, to be here for months or years and get a lease and do these other things that manifest an intention to stay, that's exactly what the United States Supreme Court said we can't condition the right to vote on. We can't do that. We need to allow people who are here, homeless people, homeless veterans. They have no fixed address. They may be here for relatively short periods of time, but they don't necessarily know where they're going to be. But while they're here, if their intention is to stay and make this their domicile, then they have a right to vote. And the Vice President's niece is no different from anyone else in that regard.
Gordon, go ahead. We got to take a break.
Okay. She came from someplace else, New York, I believe, came up here, Connecticut. Came up here, where, by the way, the requirement to vote is to be a bona fide resident. Came up here, spent a few weeks, and went back. Under the law, as Marty described earlier, she never left her domicile in Connecticut. She's still a resident, or a domicile in Connecticut for voting purposes. And the one thing we need to keep in mind is signing up to vote is a solemn and serious act. You acknowledge that when you register to vote, you're subjecting yourselves to the voting fraud statute. You're subjecting yourselves to criminal and civil penalties. She said in filling out that voter registration form that she acknowledged that domicile meant that if you were temporarily absent and then return, you haven't given up your domicile. And I think the facts suggest that that's probably what happened in this case. She never left Connecticut legally.
Okay, well, we're going to continue this debate. We'll be right back, and we'll also talk about what might be able to be done to try to fix the problem. Stay with us.
Crop tape.